The twinkling yellow lights of the Chicago night reflected off the window pane, mirroring the image of a woman standing quietly, her gaze as resolute as if she had weathered every storm life could offer. Clara Davis, was no longer the little sister overlooked at family gatherings, no longer the one standing in the shadow of her brother, but the CEO of Avalon Consulting, an empire built with her own two hands and a determination no one believed possible. This was not merely a story of a $1 billion deal or a stunning reversal of fortune where the arrogant never expected to lose. This was the journey of a woman who dared to turn pain into strength, who turned every sneer into a rung on the ladder leading to the top. In the skeptical gazes of her family and the glittering hollow splendor of that lavish wedding, Clara was no longer silent. She had waited far too long for this moment to show the world that true success never needs permission and that freedom is not something granted by others. Listen to Clara's story to see that sometimes the greatest thing of all is when you dare to stand alone and shine right in the heart of a night filled with doubt. In the soft yellow glow of crystal chandeliers hanging overhead, the grand hall of the Royal Crescent Hotel was resplendent and magnificent, like a hand-painted tableau so dazzling it made one forget to breathe. Clara Davis, stood quietly at the edge of the hall, my fingers gently tightening around a glass of champagne that shimmered with delicate white foam. The simple navy blue dress I wore seemed even more muted among the sea of guests, clad in extravagant gowns and perfectly tailored tuxedos, their endless praise a prelude to a symphony orchestrated with calculated finesse. Each step I took felt like walking on the surface of a rippling lake, where every laugh and murmur carried the echo of arrogance and the veiled scrutiny behind hollow blessings. I knew well that tonight's celebration was not just my brother Oliver's wedding day. It was a grand spectacle for him and his bride Sylvia to flaunt the kind of power my family had always revered and guarded. Beside me, my mother Eleanor approached, her gaze like a beam of light sweeping over me from my modest dress to the calm smile I forced myself to wear. "Clara, why don't you join in? The guests are asking about you," she said in a lowered voice, though her tone was laced with the same restrained exasperation that had become so familiar to me over the years. I smiled softly, placing the champagne glass on a nearby table, looking at her as if through a foggy window. In her eyes, I knew I would always be the outsider, the daughter who had refused the path they laid out, who caused them worry, not because of failure, but because of stubborn defiance. And then, as if waiting for just the perfect moment to put on a show, Oliver appeared, his arm around Sylvia, who glowed in a wedding gown adorned with sparkling crystals. His face was lit with pride, his eyes betraying a smug satisfaction as he saw me standing silent in the crowd. Still clinging to that little consulting gig, "Clara," he said, his voice pitched just loud enough for the nearby guests to hear, drawing out polite, knowing smiles. "How sad you still don't understand what real success is. Do you?" Each word seemed to drop onto the cold marble floor, but my heart didn't waver. I was long accustomed to his subtle but ruthless jabs, used to being the dull story in every family gathering. Sylvia's eyes, those of the woman who had claimed Oliver's heart and position, drifted over me with thinly veiled pity, a glance so fleeting yet so clear to them. I was still the sister, without a place, not even worth their concern. But what they didn't know, what my entire family had never known, was that the little company they so often mocked, Avalon Consulting, was the child of my own spirit, built from the first day with scraped hands and an unyielding heart. I didn't need expensive dresses or hollow compliments to prove myself, because I knew the real measure of my worth lay in every contract I secured, in every quiet but certain step I took in the business world. But tonight, amid the shimmering lights and the flowing champagne, I chose silence. I let them play their roles, let Oliver bask in the spotlight of a perfect night he believed nothing could shatter. I watched, letting their disdain settle in the air like a fine dust over my already calloused heart. Because I knew the moment I was waiting for wasn't tonight. Not in the false dance of their celebrations, but in the moment when the truth would finally come to light, when the glory they built on arrogance would crumble before the truth I carried. And I would wait for that moment with all the calm and quiet pride within me. 10 years ago, when the glittering lights and the words of praise like tonight were still far from my reach, I had begun a journey alone, a journey no one in my family ever thought I could see through to the end. While Oliver was still struggling with his mediocre grades at school and a career propped up only by the connections our parents meticulously built for him, I quietly built Avalon Consulting not with empty promises, but with a steadfastness and a vision no one could deny. I still remember the first room I rented, a tiny space above a dusty old coffee shop in the outskirts of Boston, where daylight only crept in through a grimy window. On those late nights, I sat alone typing out the earliest plans, each word, each number like seeds planted for an empire no one believed would ever grow. I learned how to read the map of the industry, to see the gaps that the giants didn't bother with, to turn other people's skepticism into fuel to keep going. While Oliver was chauffeured by our parents to meetings brimming with opportunity, I moved on my own, slowly building a small team bound as tightly as family people who believed in my dream as firmly as I did. Avalon Consulting grew from a hazy idea into one of the most formidable strategic consulting firms in the United States, expanding its branches to 12 major cities, signing contracts any company would kill for. And even when Avalon stood firm at that pinnacle, I chose to stay hidden. I let my family keep believing I was just a modest employee at a small company, letting them lull themselves into the illusion that Oliver was still the center of everyone's gaze. I didn't need their validation. I didn't need their grudging nods or their skeptical stares. Because I knew true success didn't live in anyone else's mouth. It lived in every decision, every sleepless night, every project I had turned from ruin into gold. And now, while Oliver brags about being the youngest vice president at Lennox Industries, they have no idea that it is Lennox itself begging for a meeting with Avalon, a meeting that only I, Clara Davis, can decide. Tonight, I still let them scoff when they talk about my company. I still let them think my silence is surrender, but deep in my eyes is something they will never understand: the resilience of a woman who has built an empire with her own hands and is ready to shatter every illusion with just a nod. I have tasted real success, and when the right moment comes, I know I will never have to hide it again. The music stopped abruptly, like someone had accidentally brushed against a string, and a strange silence spread across the grand, lavish hall. In the drifting air of half-sincere toasts and polite smiles, the ballroom doors swung open, revealing the figure of a man in a perfectly tailored gray suit, his silver-streaked hair catching the warm yellow light of the Royal Crescent Hotel. It was Franklin Reed, CEO of Lennox Industries, a man known throughout the industry not just for his wealth, but for a gaze sharp enough to make even the most confident pause. Oliver, standing nearby, immediately straightened his shoulders, his voice full of pride and a hint of smugness. "He's here for me, Clara. Franklin never shows up at an employee's wedding, but I'm different." I merely offered a faint smile, my eyes sweeping past Oliver in a silent confirmation that my brother still had no idea about the true weight of relationships in the business world. Franklin wasted no time scanning the crowd that was watching him with curious eyes, and when his gaze stopped at me, I saw a familiar spark flicker in those steel-gray eyes. "Clara Davis," he said, his voice low and decisive, as if stating a truth that had existed all along, but was only now being spoken aloud. I took a step forward, still holding my champagne glass, a small smile touching my lips, as the surrounding crowd fell silent, everyone holding their breath. Franklin extended his hand, his look carrying an unspoken respect. "We've been looking for you for weeks, Clara. I didn't expect to find you here at a wedding." I took that hand, his palm warm and firm like a promise that needed no words. Oliver stood frozen, his face stiffening as he realized that this encounter wasn't some orchestrated tribute to him, but the prelude to something much bigger, a truth he had long refused to believe. Clara Davis Franklin repeated his voice loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. CEO of Avalon Consulting, the company we're hoping to negotiate a very important deal with. Sylvia's eyes widened, her hand clutching Oliver's arm tightly, and I knew I had reached the moment when every lie and pretense would vanish. In the air taut as a violin string, I simply nodded calm, as though all the eyes fixed on me were nothing compared to the unwavering belief I had nurtured for so many years. Oliver drew a deep breath, panic flashing across his pale face, and I understood just one handshake between me and Franklin was enough to bring down the entire wall of arrogance my brother had spent so long building. Tonight, amid the glistening chandeliers and the silent music, I was no longer the outsider they once dismissed. I had stepped out of my own shadow, ready for everything to change forever. A moment of silence enveloped the hall, like a thin mist settling over all the artificial grandeur, and I could see in everyone's eyes an unmistakable astonishment, as if they were witnessing a crack spreading across the perfect painting they had long painted for themselves. My mother Eleanor stepped back slightly, her hands trembling as she clutched her champagne glass, while my father stood frozen, his eyes wide, as though Franklin's words had pierced right through the veil of illusions he had carefully crafted for years. Oliver, the younger brother who always believed himself to be the family's perfect child, could only stammer out meaningless phrases, his lips moving soundlessly as he watched me and Franklin standing there side by side like old friends rather than guest and host. Sylvia, his new bride, was as pale as a sheet, her hand that had been gripping his sleeve, slipping away, her eyes darting around like someone who had just realized everything she believed in was nothing but lies. In that tense air, Franklin merely inclined his head, his steel-gray eyes never leaving me, and I realized this was the moment when all their lies had shattered on their own, without a single word of defense. Murmurs began to ripple from the corners of the hall, eyes turning towards us like an underground wave, curious and admiring, as if they had never imagined that the quiet girl at family gatherings was the one behind Avalon, consulting, a name that now commanded respect across the entire financial industry. Oliver raised his hand to his face, but it couldn't hide the shame welling up in his eyes. For the first time, he realized that his own smallness could no longer be covered by the title our parents had so painstakingly built for him all these years. I lifted my glass of champagne to my lips, taking a small sip, and tasting the slight bitterness mixed with the sweet foam, a perfect flavor for this moment when I knew all those who had once looked down on me would now have to see me in a different light. In the silence that seemed to stretch on forever, I slowly set my glass down on the table, my gaze drifting over each familiar face that now felt so distant, finally pausing on Oliver, just to see the exact moment his pride crumbled. There was no need to say anything more. My presence beside Franklin had already exposed everything. And I knew in that exact second their world had been completely overturned, while mine was only just beginning to reveal the smallest part of the truth I had kept hidden for so many years. When the door to the private room closed behind us, the space seemed to freeze in time, leaving only the sound of ragged breathing and the lost looks of those who had always believed they could determine my fate. My father Richard stood there, his face deeply lined with the years of a man who once believed he could control everything, now unable to hide the shock of seeing the daughter he had always underestimated as the only one who could truly change the game. My mother Eleanor hurried forward, her hand trembling as she tried to cling to a fragile thread of hope. "Clara, you have to understand. Everything we've done has been to protect this family, and you're a part of it too." I looked at her, my gaze calm, my voice steady and free of any tremor. "I have always been a part of this family, but all these years you've forgotten that I have the right to dream too, to reach for success myself. instead of always standing quietly behind everyone else. Oliver, pale-faced, stammered, You can't. You can't do this. This is my wedding. Are you going to ruin everything? I frowned slightly, looking straight at my brother, the one who had always been so sure his spotlight would overshadow every effort I made. Oliver, don't you understand? I said softly but firmly. This isn't about a wedding or about one extravagant party. This is about the truth about things that you and everyone in this room have never wanted to see. I saw Sylvia's eyes flicker, her lips pressed tightly together, as if she feared that a single breath might shatter the wall of illusions she and Oliver had built. My father sighed, his voice heavy. Daughter, don't let a fleeting emotion destroy everything we've built over the years. I only smiled faintly, a smile that wasn't bitter, but like a quiet farewell to all the illusions they still clung to so stubbornly. Father, what you and Mother have built was for Oliver, for the image the family wanted to preserve. What I built from nothing, with no one's support, with no one's belief. And that's why today I can stand here with confidence, not to ask for permission, but to declare, Avalon Consulting will decide Lennox's future, and my brother, if he still wants a place, here will have to start again from the ground up. Oliver's mouth opened, but no words came out, while Sylvia could only clutch at her husband's arm like a drowning woman clinging to a lifeline that was no longer secure. In that moment, I no longer felt fear, no longer felt like the lost child in this house. I saw clearly a truth they refused to accept, that I, Clara Davis, had never been anyone's shadow, and I knew, right then, that true power was now in my hands, exactly where I had always believed it belonged. I took a deep breath, letting it fill my lungs like a silent affirmation to myself before I continued. The air in the closed room seemed to freeze, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock echoing in slow, measured beats. I walked slowly toward the meeting table, the place that had once been occupied only by the men in my family making decisions, while I had always been the quiet shadow pouring tea and smiling. But not today. I looked straight into Oliver's eyes, saw in them a flicker of panic and a faint hope that I might soften and take back the words I had just spoken. Oliver, I said, my voice, calm but cold. You've grown too used to having everything handed to you on a silver platter, so much so that you've forgotten no one owes you success. From now on, if you want to survive in the company you boast about so proudly, you will have to prove yourself. There will be no more favoritism or family safety nets. Only your own ability can save you. I turned to my mother, saw her lips quiver, tears shimmering at the corners of her eyes, a testament to the crumbling of the misplaced hopes she had once held so tightly. I do not deny my blood, Mother, I said softly, though my tone held an unyielding firmness, but I will no longer sacrifice myself to feed someone else's ambition. From now on, I will not step back anymore. My father's eyes darkened suddenly. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then stopped as if he knew that every argument he might offer had already become meaningless. I shifted my gaze to Sylvia, saw her bow her head, her fingers laced so tightly they were white. Perhaps for the first time in her life she understood that everything she had once been promised meant nothing without the real power to back it. In that moment, I heard myself continue, my voice as sure as a vow. This merger, the deal Franklin Reed is waiting for, will go forward on Avalon's terms, not Lennox's and not those of our family. And I, as CEO of Avalon Consulting, will be the one to put an end to these games that have gone on far too long. Oliver looked as though cold water had been poured over him, his face draining of color bit by bit. And I, for the first time in many years, felt no fear. I only felt freed, as if I had cut away the invisible chains that had tied me to the illusions others had created. I knew in that exact moment I was declaring to the world and to my family that Clara Davis was no longer the obedient daughter who quietly nodded along. I had become a woman no lie could ever shadow again. The next morning, I put on a meticulously tailored black suit, every line of it catching the early light of Chicago like armor shielding the faith I had built over the years. As I stepped into the boardroom of Lennox Industries, the air was already heavy, a silent challenge, and I felt every step I took not just echoing on the marble floor, but carving itself into the stares of those sitting across from me. 15 directors, powerful faces, eyes scrutinizing hands, gripping their pens as if holding on to a fragile kind of authority. I saw Franklin Reed stand up, extending his hand to greet me, a smile of respect on his face that brought a hush over the room. "Ms. Davis," he said, his voice deep and warm yet resolute. "We are honored to hear what you have to bring us today." I responded with a slight nod, feeling an invisible strength coursing down my spine, a strength that didn't come from titles or dazzling lights, but from the resilience I had forged with tears and sleepless nights. I opened the plan, letting the numbers and stark lines of text speak for me, each item of restructuring each strategy to replace those who clung to borrowed power with people truly capable of creating value. "We will no longer let these positions be filled by connections instead of competence." I said, my voice even and firm, like a declaration of the change to come. I saw some of the board members begin to nod their puzzled eyes, shifting to looks of respect, while a few others tried to hide their panic behind a mask of calm. Through the clear glass, I caught a glimpse of Oliver and my parents standing outside, their faces pale, as they realized that in this room they no longer held any power to interfere. I knew they were listening to every word I said, every sentence like a blade cutting through the illusion they had so long woven. Franklin stood beside me, his eyes reflecting satisfaction and a deep trust. In that moment, I realized that all the years I had spent quietly building Avalon Consulting had led me to exactly this place, to declare to the world that no one could ever again relegate me to the shadows. And as I finished the presentation, I gently closed the file, took a long, deep breath, and looked straight at the board of directors with the eyes of someone who would no longer fear any judgment. In the almost sacred silence of that room, I knew today I hadn't just redrawn the map of Lennox Industries. I had redrawn the course of my own destiny. Stepping out of the meeting room, I felt the air outside wash over my skin, like a cool wave sweeping away the fatigue, but also leaving behind the taste of an ending that could never be reversed. I saw my mother Eleanor standing there, her face wet with tears, yet still clinging to a facade of composure. "Clara, you're still my daughter. We're still a family," she whispered like a fragile plea. I paused, letting my gaze linger on the familiar lines of the woman who had spent her life painting the perfect portrait of Oliver, never once seeing me beyond the expectations she had draped over my shoulders. "Mother," I said softly, my voice steady and unshaken. "Family is sacred, but only when it doesn't demand someone to sacrifice themselves to sustain another's illusions." My eyes flicked to Oliver, seeing that my brother could no longer meet my gaze, and Sylvia could only bow her head, her hands clasped together tightly as if trying to hold on to the thin veneer of status she once thought unbreakable. My father stood still, his face as closed off as a marble statue, but I knew in those eyes was an abyss of confusion he could never fill with the same old lessons he'd always tried to teach. I turned away, walking slowly down the long hallway that led to the grand foyer, each step a declaration that I had stepped past the worn boundary of this family. I was no longer the obedient daughter who endured their plans and well-crafted advice. I had become the author of my own story, no longer letting anyone else define my worth. When the foyer doors opened, the strong midday light shone straight into me like a halo I no longer feared to embrace. In my heart there was no regret, only a quiet peace and a fresh sense of freedom. Because I knew that after all the years of silence and acquiescence, I had finally opened the door that freed me from the shadow of expectations that never belonged to me. And that step was the first toward living a life no longer shrouded by the illusions of others. That night, as the city of Chicago donned its shimmering cloak of golden lights, I returned to my penthouse office where every wall, every lamp, bore the imprint of a dream I had quietly built over the years. I sat by the wide glass window, my fingers tracing the silver bracelet, the last gift from the grandmother I loved most, the one who once whispered to me, "True strength isn't waiting for others to believe in you. It's believing in yourself." I lifted my gaze to the world outside, seeing the city move in hushed motion, like a river of light that never stopped flowing. In my heart, there was no longer a trace of confusion or fear, only the serene certainty of someone who had claimed her place without the need for anyone else's validation. I thought of my mother of Oliver, of the looks that had once made me doubt myself. And then I smiled a smile not for them, but for me, the one who had overcome it all to come home to herself. I knew after everything I didn't need to seek revenge or demand back anything at all. My success, the truth they could never deny, was the clearest answer of all. And tomorrow, when the dawn rose over the damp streets, I would once again don my black suit, stepping into Avalon Consulting's boardroom as the woman who had turned every insult into the foundation on which she now stood tall. I knew the road ahead would still be long with challenges yet to be named, but with a faith no one could take away, I would never again allow myself to be eclipsed by anyone. I had walked through every doubt, every whispered rumor, and now I, Clara Davis, was the embodiment of resilience and freedom that no one could extinguish. The night in Chicago was quiet, but in my heart a flame glowed silently to remind myself that from now on I would not merely live, but shine in my own way. Clara Davis's story is not just a victory in a merger or a family coup, but an undeniable testament that real power comes from daring to believe in yourself even when no one else does. The Chicago night flowed on quietly, but from this day forward, Clara was no longer the shadow on the sidelines. She had become the one who would redraw her own future. If you've ever felt cornered in the dark, remember you have the right to step out. Hold your head high and turn your silence into the strongest voice of all. Tap follow or subscribe to never miss the next story of those who dare to break through every limit and step boldly into their own journey. Because who knows, their story might just be the spark that lights your way.